Yes, Mr. Cory, Wright.
Thank you, sir. My name is Charlie Cory Wright, and as part of a small team of solicitors and barristers, I represent NHS Blood and Transplant in this inquiry. It feels a bit strange to be introducing myself to everyone when we worked together in the same room for nearly 4 years. But that's the way the inquiry process works, and I'm sure to everyone's relief, I've not said much publicly since 2018 in relation to this. I should explain what I propose to do in my 2.5 or so hours. 5 things, I hope. First, I'm going to make some opening remarks about the inquiry itself, about NHBT's role in it, and about the infected and affected. I'm going to explain what we did in our written submissions, and given that this is a separate exercise, essentially what I'm doing just now, explaining the purpose of these submissions. I'm going to cover in this first section, and indeed amplify, a fair bit of the ground that we covered in the early part of our written submissions, which was intended specifically for core participants as well as for Sir Brian, and that may take a bit of time. Secondly, I want to deal with some of the detailed past historical matters in order to cover some topics that have been discussed in the written submissions, but we think should be addressed by us orally as well, sometimes because they've been picked up by others in their submissions and we need to respond to that. Thirdly, and importantly as well, I'm going to explain about the present position. What's changed, what's in place now. It's really important for us to be clear about that because the inquiry can only make recommendations as to the future with full knowledge of the current position. And it's apparent to us that some of the present position isn't necessarily widely known. And that may be in part because much of it was based on evidence provided by Dr. Mifflin to the inquiry, which evidence was given in writing, but to which he was never asked to speak. A good example of this, perhaps I can just explain what I'm talking about. We've had a number of suggestions from others that haemovigilance was something that needed to be adopted in the UK by us. It is something that we've been doing for many years, and that's all set out in that statement, but I'm going to deal with that when we come to it, because it is integral to current approaches to safety. Fourthly, I'm going to describe NHBT's position as in relation to the future in the context of the recommendations that we have suggested for Sir Brian to make, and indeed that others have suggested. And finally, to make some concluding remarks. First of all, then, some thanks. It's important, even though this has already been done by others and no doubt will continue to be done by more others, to pay tribute and to say thank you to the inquiry and to all involved in it over the last 4 years while we've been here. Thanks and such tribute to the chair, to counsel to the inquiry, to all the inquiry staff, and by that I mean Rhys, George and Sam, as well as Laura, Eamon, Angela and David and all the others who have looked after us while we've been here. Quite apart from their work for us all day to day, that last cohort, Laura and her team have been crucial in dealing with witnesses, many of whom were elderly and vulnerable, and without the assistance given to them to put them at their ease, the quality of the evidence given to the inquiry would have been much less. So a really big thank you to them. Thanks to all the other participants, but most particularly, of course, thanks to the infected and affected cohort who have been here throughout and alongside whom we have immersed ourselves in the inquiry process. I will pay a proper tribute to them in a moment. At the preliminary hearing on the 26th of September 2018, I gave, on behalf of NHSBT, a commitment to the inquiry and to the infected and affected. And I hope no one will mind if I remind us all what that commitment was. I said this: it goes, we hope, without saying, that NHSBT fully supports the inquiry in all of its terms of reference. Our primary concern is for those who were given infected blood or infected blood products, and for their families and others who've been affected by this. We do know that we can never truly understand the impact this has had on the infected, their families and loved ones. However, we do of course know that impact has been devastating. One only has to have paid attention to what's been said over the last 3 days. This was on the final day of that preliminary hearing, to be aware of that. We understand that our job is to provide the inquiry team with all the help that we can in fulfilling its terms of reference. We will do whatever we can to assist the inquiry in order that answers can be provided to the questions asked by those infected and those affected. We will be open, constructive and honest. Our motivation is to get to the truth for those infected and affected to the best of our abilities. In that sense, we share, we hope, the same approach as the inquiry itself. Indeed, we understand that this inquiry is above all things a search after truth, the unvarnished truth about all of the many disquieting things that we've been hearing about over the last 3 days. We do get it. That if the inquiry is able to do that job properly, then that is likely to include the uncovering of facts that are seriously unpalatable. Whatever those truths may be, we want to say loud and clear at the outset that we too are very sorry for what happened to all those infected, all those affected, all who are victims. We also understand that actions speak louder than words. We hope that we're demonstrating that in our cooperation with the inquiry, both thus far and as it continues, as well as in the terms of the safety measures we now apply in screening protocols and the like, which I will outline in a moment. We do understand and embrace the need for the inquiry to apply current clinical science and current standards and norms to its scrutiny of what went wrong. It's only by doing that that the lessons that need to be learnt will be clear. Finally, I hope I can help by mentioning this morning's invitation by Stephen Snowden QC, who raised Bishop James Jones's 6-point charter for public bodies and invited those here involved to sign up to that charter. That question having been raised, NHSBT has considered the charter and its 6 points. We do not see these 6 points as any different to the commitment we were already making to the inquiry, and in those circumstances, we confirm our intention to be guided by and to strive to follow those principles. I do very much hope that we've demonstrated by our actions since then that we meant it when we gave that commitment and that we've sought to honour our pledge throughout. Now, turning to the inquiry and its task, it is an important discipline in all significant and long-term endeavours for those involved to be able on occasion to step away from what's being dealt with in the moment so as to be able to review the exercise as a whole. We as a team obviously had to do that when we were reviewing all the evidence for the purposes of writing our written submissions. It was very worthwhile. It was also, frankly, a humbling exercise. It's easy to lose sight of the inquiry's achievement over these years of evidence gathering and presentation at hearings when one has been deep in the inquiry process throughout that. That achievement has been remarkable. First and foremost, it's been in honouring the inquiry's commitment to put the infected and affected and their terrible experiences at the heart of its investigation. But beyond that, it has also been in ensuring that those experiences, for so long unheard or ignored, are now woven into the fabric of all of the evidence the inquiry has called, from whatever quarter, from that of the individuals who suffered, and also from that of the politicians and civil servants, scientists, clinicians and experts who've given evidence to it. It goes without saying, but many have said it already, and I say it again, that the evidence the inquiry has heard over its 5 years from the infected and affected has been particularly and profoundly moving. Witnesses have given detailed accounts of great suffering. They've spoken of losing their children, siblings, parents and partners to terrible diseases, of suffering tremendous ill health, both physically and mentally, of stigma and discrimination, and of a lack of assistance and support so that many have had to face the world isolated. For those who've attended over the 5 years, it's been moving and humbling to hear and to read that evidence. We did not, in our written submissions, wish to identify any particular individual account or any particular witness in seeking to pay tribute to the infected and affected. That was because we thought it might suggest we were valuing one person or a few people's experiences over those of others. But having thought about this a bit more, we think that's wrong, because it might seem or feel like we were maintaining a distance or being indifferent to what we've heard. So we do want to mention a couple of individuals in the hope that this can be seen as a proper medium by which we can express our feelings about, if that's not too awkward a phrase, and pay tribute to the wider cohort of all the many infected and affected from whom or about whom we've heard. We've chosen these ones because they're striking, but also particularly given that they've been specifically singled out by their own representatives already. At the conclusion of his closing submissions, Stephen Snowden, KC, referred to Lee Turton, born with haemophilia A, diagnosed at the age of 4 with HIV after treatment with a contaminated batch of factor VIII, and died in January 1992 at the age of 10. I know that that terrible summary won't remotely do justice to him, but those were the raw facts. We watched a series of video clips relating to Lee, concluding, I think, with a clip taken at Christmas just 1 month before he died. No one who watched that video will ever forget it. I don't think I need to, or I ought to, say more than that, save only to say thank you to Lee's family for being able to share those deeply private and poignant moments with the world. And, as I say, I hope that tribute can stand as a thank you to everyone else who has shared in some way in order to shed light on these terrible events. Brian Cummins, Stephen Snowden's colleague in the Collins team, made specific mention of the evidence of John Peach. Mr. Peach and his first wife, Susan, who died in the early 1980s, had 2 sons, Lee and Jason, born in 1966 and 1969. Both had haemophilia A. Both went to Trelaws. Mr. Peach told the inquiry how they thought Lister Concentrate was a godsend. They had no idea when the boys left Trelaws that they had tested positive for HDLV3, and they found out both were infected at the same time. He told us how, after their diagnoses, their world fell apart. He told us how they tried to make the best of things and how they died just 5 months apart at the ages of 23 and 27, and of how he misses them every day. All he wants now is the truth. Once again, no one who heard his evidence and saw the courage it took for him to give it will ever forget it. Once again, I hope that it's appropriate to make mention of him, to pay tribute to him and his family, and to use that memory as a symbol for the suffering of others that we all ought to recognise. All those who shared their stories gave to all those of us who have been at the inquiry day to day or have followed it online an invaluable insight into the suffering of the infected and affected, into their grief, and as to how their lives have been transformed from what they were entitled to expect. We've heard of the impact of stigma and discrimination and the difficulties faced by those living with HIV and HCV, in many cases alongside haemophilia. It's against this backdrop that we must acknowledge the strength of those who brought this inquiry into being, the patients' groups, whose efforts ensured that the inquiry has taken place. It has taken too long. We hope that this inquiry has been, and we hope it will continue to be, an important trigger for collective efforts to ensure the quality of care offered across the health services. We hope that this inquiry delivers answers that the infected and affected have campaigned for and deserve. These experiences have been with us throughout, and it's not just that, as a quick review of the witness list over the years would confirm, the inquiry both commenced and then concluded by giving the infected and affected the opportunity to tell the stories of these experiences. What's also really striking to those who've had the opportunity to attend the hearings throughout is that it has achieved something that in prospect would have been surprising. It has given all taking part a strong sense of collective endeavour. This is certainly so from the point of view of NHSBT, which has tried throughout to deliver on its own promise of fulsome engagement and assistance. It's also so, we detect, across the range of core participants, whether infected and affected or not. The seeds, and indeed shoots, of this sense of collective endeavour have been there all along. They were evident even at that preliminary hearing in Church House in September 2018. It was plain that there was a desire on the part of the participants as a whole for a positive approach. The atmosphere in the hearing room was, initially, and perhaps inevitably, palpably tense. But even at that stage, there was a striking generosity of spirit, which included a positive response in the room to what was said by those speaking for institutional CPs, such as myself, once those CPs had demonstrably committed themselves to the inquiry's task. That spirit has continued throughout the last 4 years. Attendance at the hearings has been characterised on all sides by friendliness at an individual level and a gradually gathering sense of a common task in the job of getting to the truth and ensuring that this sort of thing can never happen again. That this is so is itself perhaps the best testament to the task undertaken by the chair and the inquiry team, who've been assiduous in ensuring that the experiences of those who've suffered is woven into its proceedings in the way described above. Now, NHSBT has throughout both understood and welcomed the fact that this scrutiny of past events has taken the experiences of the infected and affected as its starting point, and then gone on to weave them into the fabric of the inquiry's work. But given that that is the approach, it is, we submit, vital for the inquiry to bear in mind the extent here of the potential consequences, unless guarded against, of seeing only through this lens. This applies particularly to the examination with hindsight of the events as they took place in real time. And in that context, to any explanations given to the inquiry of why things were done the way they were, or why they were not done differently. I'll come on to deal with that more fully in a moment. I'd like to say a little more about the infected and affected themselves. They have been the touchstone of this inquiry, all with individual stories that come together to map a tragedy that has run for many decades. And as we have said, we cannot do justice to all the individual stories here, but we have no doubt that the inquiry can and will be able to do so. Without their evidence, the depth of the experiences of the infected and affected would have been obscured or lost. Thus again, NHSBT wishes to express its gratitude for their evidence in circumstances where the stories told were of great pain and suffering, and to recognise the dignity and courage with which that evidence has been given. I would add that we heard loud and clear what Rohana Maharaj said in her submissions on behalf of the Thalassemia Society on Friday. I include that now because what she says is equally something important for us to acknowledge and act on. Although her own role is a very specific one, it seems to us to have a resonance that goes back beyond that of the thalassemia sufferers. I will come back to that when we deal with recommendations below. Most importantly, we wish to restate what we hope has been clear throughout, that we recognise the hurt, pain and suffering of those who've been infected or affected by such infection through blood and blood products. We express our deepest sympathies and for any respect in which it is found that the blood services or the blood that they supplied was the cause of that suffering to any person, we apologise unreservedly. Now, I'd like to say something about reviewing the past and the inquiry's approach to that. The approach of seeing things through the lens of the infected and affected has made the task of NHSBT and its representatives that much easier to undertake, in terms both of the spirit in which it is done and of the ability to focus without unnecessary distraction or worse, any sense of an adversarial approach on the various common tasks in hand. It's important, nonetheless, for all, for NHSBT, other CPs, and most of all the inquiry and its team, to bear in mind the ramifications of this approach on the mindset of all concerned. The starting point is, of course, that these matters have all to be considered in the context, ever present in the mind of all involved in the inquiry, that we are largely dealing with matters between 50 and 30 years ago. And it's obvious that this passage of time not only represents delay in the detailed investigation of what happened, and thus injustice for those who've suffered, it also prejudices, at least to some extent, the search for truth, something which affects all participants. For those of us who were alive and aware in the 1970s and 1980s, our memory works well, but only in very specific ways. We can remember events that were particularly important to us personally, and we've heard much about that. Both that they did happen and how they made us feel. But even in the case of such events, we may well be unable to remember the precise chronology or the detail of what happened. As to more public events, it's not difficult for us to summon up their general historical sweep. In the 1970s, the three-day week and its associated power cuts, the winter of discontent, the appointment of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, and abroad, the end of the Vietnam War and Watergate. In the 1980s, HIV and AIDS, the Falklands War, the Iran, Iraq and Soviet-Afghan wars, and the beginnings of the internet and of emails as correspondence. All, of course, among many others. So, again, we can remember them happening, but we do not necessarily remember when or even in what order. We are reliant upon the archives for that. What is much harder for us to do is to recall the social and the practical day-to-day context in which these things happened. This is made clear to us whenever we see archive film of the times, as we have done in this inquiry. We get a slight jolt of surprise when we're reminded of what people looked like, or their clothes, or their cars, or some of what they used to say. This slight jolt demonstrates to us how ingrained the habit is of seeing the past through the lens of the present, and, related but separate, of projecting the present, along with all its assumptions, back into the past. Both the sweep of underlying societal and technological changes and their practical day-to-day manifestations are important for the inquiry for all sorts of reasons. They're relevant to society. They're relevant to governments, to the NHS, and to other public health services in the UK. They're relevant to the practice of medicine, which has changed fundamentally because of progress in medicine itself, in science, in culture, and in technology. And they are relevant to the users of those services and their lived experiences. We hope that some further exploration of this is helpful. First of all, societal differences. It's necessary to bear in mind the wide social and legal transformations of the last 40 years. As well as the landmark events referred to above, there are major differences between expectations and habits then and now, and between attitudes then and now. First of all, expectations and habits day to day. It's striking and often surprising at first to be reminded about the changes that have been over this time in the nuts and bolts of people's lives. One obvious and important difference relates to the normal methods and the normal speed of communications and information gathering. Instant communication was emphatically not the norm. Obviously, there were telephones, but there were no mobile phones, no texts, no emails, and only limited access to the internet, at least until the very end of this period. The point here is not that instant remote communication was impossible. It was not. You could communicate by telephone or by telex. The point is that it was not the norm. The expectation was that anything that was not either an emergency or immediately personal business would be dealt with on paper, and this took time. This meant that expectations as to communications over distance were completely different then. Such communications took days at least, and the expectation was often for them to take weeks. In most cases, no one regarded that as strange or problematic. Perhaps the best example of this is the terms on which bills were to be settled at that time, which seem really quite remarkable to all of us now. The standard wording on most bills stated that they should be paid within a month, or sometimes 4 weeks. Often they would, as a matter of pride on the part of the customer, be dealt with more quickly than that, but that's not the point. The point is that the general social assumption, the expectation, was that that was an acceptable period for responding. This was emblematic of attitudes more generally about communication. Families kept in touch, but often by letter or postcard, rather than by phone call or text. I should stress, we do not wish to make too much of all this. Obviously, there were many decisions to be made or actions to be performed that were urgent and that had to be effected immediately. However, the default position in that era was one of less speed and, bluntly, some might say, less impatience. That must be at least part of the explanation for the surprise that we all do now feel at the apparently slow response times on ostensibly important matters. Even where this does not excuse them, and in many cases it doesn't, it does in part explain them. Attitudes. There were many commonly held social attitudes during the 70s and 80s which would now seem anachronistic, and some that now seem to have been wholly inappropriate, even making allowances for the different social context of those times. We stress we mention this now not in any way to excuse them, it's rather to identify them as factors that would have represented obstacles to relevant action or change at the time. In particular, there was very commonly a real discomfort with any honest or serious discussion about sex. This was present in most households and even extended, as the inquiries heard, to some clinicians. It's been reflected in the evidence that the inquiry has heard from all sorts of quarters, including the evidence from the highest echelons of politics and the evidence from those who were the subject of unfair stigma and abuse. It's a discomfort which constrained public consciousness and discourse, and possibly for many in private as well, in a strange hinterland between comedy, the Carry-On shows and Dick Emery, prurience, and, hidden behind those things, and most relevant to this inquiry, simple disapproval, for some shading into disgust, if not at the idea of sex itself, at least at the idea of discussions about it. The consequence was that there is very little public debate about sex, and very little by way of forum in which to have any serious discussion about it, even when the need arose, apart possibly in academia and in medical circles. This feature of the times, ignorance, combined with socially enforced silence about sex, was inevitably a fertile breeding ground for homophobia, widespread, on occasions express and acute, otherwise as low-level but ever-present background noise. People were presumably aware of homosexuality, but many refused to acknowledge it or accept it. Its treatment in popular culture was often by demeaning stereotypes designed to ridicule and with the effect, conscious or otherwise, of bolstering and enforcing an othering of homosexuality and homosexuals. Evidence heard by the inquiry has confirmed that the inability freely to discuss matters relating to sex during the 70s and even the 80s created real difficulties in putting necessary initiatives into effect. For example, generally those relating to public awareness of HIV/AIDS, and more specifically here, those relating to donor selection. The idea of public, or in many cases even private, discussion of whether sex was of a particular sort or not would have been unthinkable during the 70s and 80s, and such discussion would have run a high risk of being counterproductive. This was essentially for two reasons. First, because of a squeamishness in addressing it on part of decision makers. But secondly, also because of a real and probably justified concern on the part of decision makers that addressing these matters directly with the public would not achieve the desired result. Sections of the public would recoil rather than take in the evidence. Of course, at one level, we know all this. The point is, though, we don't always factor it into our thinking as much as is appropriate. Changes over the years. We've already said on some of the technological advances, talked about some of the technological advances since the 70s and 80s. As well as their general societal impact, these advances have changed the management and operation systems of the health services, including the blood services. They represent very significant improvements in the creation and dissemination of research material, created new possibilities for record-keeping, testing and patient information services, and have increased the speed of adaptation to new changes. In the 70s and 80s themselves, by contrast, clinicians were working with tools that were rudimentary, no email or internet, or indeed access to computers. News and research journals travelled by post. Conference attendance was comparatively rare. MS-DOS was not even in general use until the mid to late 80s. So in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, doctors, in common with the rest of the population, were relying on some combination of typewriters, fax machines, and handwritten notes. There have been transformations in the practice of medicine. These include changes in the doctor-patient relationship in respect of sharing information, views on medical paternalism and consent, multiple legal and policy initiatives emphasising patient choice. These changes were then in turn reflected by changes in societal and legal norms, as well as by professional regulation. This effect was something that the ethics experts recognised as part of their oral evidence. As Professor Savulescu said, there's another distinction which I think is very important in this debate, and that's between moral relativism and context specificity. So, what can be right in one context can be wrong in another. And that doesn't mean you don't have some universal or moral objectively true principles in both of them. That doesn't mean that you don't have some universal or moral objectively true principles in both of them. It means that the facts are different. And Professor Kerridge, in medicine, as in many other spheres of life, we can see examples of practices and behaviours that at one particular point were deemed acceptable, but subsequently with further thinking, sometimes, and it's just with further thinking it becomes clear, that these are just not acceptable and were actually never acceptable. The importance of context specificity means that it's relevant in terms of understanding the past and in terms of assessing the conduct, decisions and actions of people in the past to take into account the mores, standards and customs of the time. The changes in the organisation of the blood service during this period are described in the written submissions that we provided, and I'll touch on those in the next section. These changes transformed the organisation, capabilities and practice of the blood service. They introduced new levels of consistency in practice, for example, through the centralisation of the organisation and the transformation of the relationship with central government. The evidence that the inquiry has heard makes it plain that the blood service professionals were trying to maintain the supply of blood and make it as safe as it could be in the context of the times and the systems within which they were working. Detailed accounts of the history of the English blood services, which are helpful in demonstrating the degree to which it was initially a patchwork operation, are set out in the witness statements of Dr. Angela Robinson and Dr. Gail Mifflin. It was explored in our written submissions in detail in the section The Blood Service and Its Role and Running the Blood Service. It may be an obvious point, but is only once identified, that the context here also includes all the other important life-enhancing and life-saving services and functions being provided by the blood services. I'd like now to turn from contextual changes since those times to other factors relevant to our own consideration of the past, relating more to us than to the events that we're assessing. Nothing, can I stress, that I'm about to say is intended to be taken as undermining the lived experience of the infected and affected as described by them, or suggesting that the accounts that they've given are in any way not correct. That is not the purpose of these submissions. What we say, we do simply because these are relevant factors which the inquiry, we say, should bear in mind when weighing the evidence it's heard from others as well. So first of all, reliance upon memory of recent events. Much of the evidence heard by the inquiry consists simply of personal recollection, often assisted by relevant documentary record, itself often incomplete. When I say simply there, I don't mean merely, I mean unassisted by other things. Memory is, of course, a powerful evidential resource, whether that evidence is given to the inquiry in writing or orally. Those who've given evidence have done a remarkable job of recollecting events that happened 30 or 40 years ago. However, that evidence is, by definition, difficult to test now. Furthermore, the timescales involved mean that there are important limitations as to its reliability. Those limitations should be considered when the inquiry assesses this evidence. There are a number of distinct points here. First, what is encoded in a witness's memory is determined by what they attend to, what they've stored as important. And one might add, in relation to the accounts given by infected and affected, often what is seared onto their memory in the way described by Ms. Monaghan in her submissions late last week. And as I say, I am not in any sense seeking to undermine that. Secondly, a huge amount of material has been disclosed to the inquiry. For many of our mostly elderly witnesses, reviewing and scanning potentially relevant material has been necessary to prompt memories and clarify events of many years before. That process of presenting witnesses with selected contemporaneous written documentation after a significant period has elapsed will itself have had an impact on the evidence to the inquiry. Invariably, in refreshing witnesses' memories, looking at these documents may also itself alter the witnesses' memories. Thirdly, this is further complicated by the way that the inquiry's knowledge has developed over its duration. With each additional batch of documents and questions to the witnesses, the inquiry's own understanding of events has developed organically. That's inevitable. The questions posed and the answers given reflect the developing nature of this undertaking. Finally, there's the problem of memory of one aspect of the past without the context of the others. Recall prompted by the inquiry's investigations lacks that context, and there is therefore a risk that the other priorities that were part of the picture back then but are no longer part of the picture are not remembered. We have no doubt at all that all concerned in the inquiry are well aware of these points. Once again, none of them is intended to represent criticism of the way in which the inquiry has performed its function. They're made simply in the interests of fairness and in the hope that they will help the inquiry to keep them in mind when undertaking its consideration of the events. Hindsight. There are a number of points here. I've already dealt with the question of the review of past events being seen through the lens of 21st century thinking and norms, and I'm not going to go back over that now. It may, on the face of it, seem to us all that it should be a relatively straightforward exercise to keep the fact that we are now significantly better informed than people at the time in mind. However, the practicalities of excluding hindsight in these circumstances where it should be excluded are more complex than they might appear. We know that we know many of the answers to the questions that were, back in the day, unanswered. For example, what was the nature of NA&B? How serious was it? In relation to HIV/AIDS, what is the nature of this infection? Is it a virus? Is it one or a number of viruses? We can attempt to put ourselves in the position of those who did not know the answers to those questions. In doing so, we can imagine not knowing them, but it's much harder to give due colour or weight to the significance back then of what we now know to be wrong answers but didn't know then, or wrong lines of inquiry that led nowhere, scientific blind alleys or worse. This applies most particularly in the context of the cutting edges of scientific progress. Why did it take so long to discover X or Y? But it's equally important in relation to steps dependent upon and subsequent to that scientific endeavour, which are necessary to make practical progress in the real world in the light of it. Thus, it can be acutely relevant to understanding, for example, the explanations for delays in the implementation of scientific or other steps, which steps have subsequently proved obviously sensible. The danger, put shortly, is that these steps may seem, with hindsight, always to have been obviously sensible, when at the time they were not. The particular danger here is that in considering decisions as to what should be done to minimise risk. For example, it's not obvious, viewed in prospect only, to be sure of the ramifications of taking or not taking any particular step. Indeed, for this reason, it's not always obvious what would be the cautious approach. The right answer is often, by definition, not obvious, or even apparent. A useful analogy for the review now of such situations is the challenge of the cryptic crossword puzzle. We don't know the answer to a clue until we've solved it. Similarly, we don't know until then how long it's going to take to do so. Once we have solved it, it often seems to us that it was completely obvious, and that it's hard to understand why we didn't identify it before. It feels like we must have been being stupid or taking so long to solve the problem. That reaction, understandable, but in fact often wrong-headed, is, we submitted, an important one to bear in mind in this context. There is a danger here that in assessing the conduct of those tasked with finding answers back in the day or deciding on strategy, we are distracted by our hindsight, our knowledge of those answers. We're distracted into missing or ignoring the fact that these things were often emphatically not obvious to those people dealing with the problem at the time. Again, almost by definition, they didn't become obvious until science advanced so as to mean that that was so. In short, the problem is twofold. We cannot unlearn what we now know, and while we may know that fact, we don't always bear it in mind. I'm going to mention very briefly the contents of our written submissions in case anyone hasn't had a chance to look at them and would like to know the topics that are covered in there. The specific topics with which we deal. In relation to the blood service and the blood supply, there's a topic on the blood service and its role, decision-making and reliability of the blood supply, running the blood service, self-sufficiency. Dealing with particular infections and responses to them, sections on hepatitis generally, HIV, non-A, non-B, hepatitis C, HIV look-back, HCV look-back, and VCJD. Other related matters, a section dealing with consent, a section dealing with record-keeping, a section dealing with teaching and transfusion practice, and a section dealing with minimising the risk of transfusion-transmitted infection, and then concluding section on recommendations that the inquiry might make. So now I turn to the historical section. This is dealing with only a very few topics which seem to us particularly important to raise now, either because they weren't covered in our written submissions because they've been raised since then by others, or because we feel they need to be emphasised in particular. The central role of the blood service has been and remains to obtain a reliable supply of blood from voluntary, unremunerated donors and to make that supply available for transfusion and for use in blood products. When we say reliable, we mean a supply which is safe for all recipients, including prospective recipients, and a supply which is sufficient for all recipients, including prospective recipients. At the outset of our oral submissions, we began with an apology. That apology is because we failed in this role. Numerous of our witnesses have recognised failings in what we did in the past, and we apologise for those wholeheartedly. We deal with those apologies in detail in our written submissions, and I certainly don't want to go through the task of listing what we've said sorry for in the written submissions. They're there for people to see. I will give one example now, and that is the taking of donations of blood from prisons and other correctional institutions. Simply put, the blood service made the wrong decision. Once it was recognised that the blood of those donors was at higher risk than the general population, those donations should have ended. In not ending those donations, people will have been infected by blood that we took. We sincerely apologise for that. In making our written submissions and these oral submissions, we don't seek to row back from any of these apologies for the things that we got wrong. We've also made apologies for making decisions that were the wrong decisions to make, often difficult decisions which had complex competing circumstances. However, where we took the wrong decision, we are sorry. The purpose of these submissions, I hope it's clear already, is not to avoid blame. It's to assist the inquiry and the infected and affected in understanding what the blood service did and why. We've hoped throughout that that is so, and we continue to do so. We've said a lot in our written submissions on the historical matters, as I've said, but there are three topics that I want to deal with orally: structure and function of the blood service, donors, and testing. Now, first of all, structure and function of the blood service. From its inception in around 93-94, the blood service operated as a loose federation of independent regional transfusion centres. Instead of being bound together as an organisation, they were bound to their regional hospital boards, later regional health authorities. There was no, health boards. There was no executive control within the blood service, nor over those who received our blood, be that fractionation laboratories, hospital blood banks, or clinicians. While the advisory committee in the early 1980s and the national directorate from the late 1980s gave some internal direction, it was only in 93-94 that centralised and executive control was established in the National Blood Authority. This was not for a lack of desire on the part of the regional transfusion directors to be a centralised service. The CTI team has produced a very helpful presentation, that's INQY 40307, which sets out the various requests made and the views expressed of regional transfusion directors. We've referred to this and indeed relied upon it in our written submissions of para 54 to 58. Neither was it for a lack of perceived benefit from a centralised service. Such would have provided hope for a unified approach to policy internal to the service, for a unified approach with the fractionation laboratories, centralised funding, which was not regionally determined by RHAs, executive authority to issue directions to other healthcare providers. Indeed, this is what eventuated when the NBA was established. The result of this lack of centralisation and executive control is set out in detail in our closing submissions. Two things to highlight just for present purposes. In respect of self-sufficiency, the situation is a complex one. The CTI have again produced a helpful analysis which goes through the issue in detail, and this is INQY 40333. And we have made submissions on this in detail at our section 6. At this stage, we wish simply to say that a centralised service had significant benefits over a diffuse one, and that a centralised service would have made a significant difference in achieving self-sufficiency at an earlier stage. In respect of executive control, that's the second topic, over other practitioners, the inquiry has heard about the weight placed on clinical freedom for practitioners. The remit of the blood service did not include direction of clinicians outside the service. Indeed, even when the service direction was diffuse between RTCs. We did issue guidelines, including notes on transfusion in the 1960s through to the 1980s. The 1973 notes on transfusion, if anyone wants to look at it, are at HCDO 40861. The Red Book was issued after that. A number of our witnesses also spoke of being involved in teaching, whether in the context of the times and in our state was a diffuse set of RTCs with no executive authority nor centralised funding. Going beyond this would have been possible or feasible is unclear. We say it was a great difficulty considering our status. The second topic was donors. The blood service would not be able to fulfil its core role without donors. We know that all are aware of that fact. Without sufficient donors to meet the demand for blood components, including specific components such as immunoglobulins and rarer blood groups, sufficiency of supply would be compromised. Such a failure of supply would itself be a significant safety risk. The question of supply in each RTC over the decades focused on by this inquiry is a complex one. Shortages occurred, and the risk of shortages was an ever-present consideration. Indeed, were the introduction or not of a new policy potentially impacted sufficiency of supply, then that consideration was a risk which had to be understood and accounted for in any analysis of whether to introduce the policy. Furthermore, the extent of the risk of a novel policy to the donation numbers was by its nature unknown. In those circumstances, the question then arose as to whether a cautious approach to quantifying that risk should have been taken before factoring in the risk to supply into the overall decision to adopt the new policy. Might have militated against that. We deal with much of the matter of donors in section 3 of our written submissions, and section 5, that's the blood service and its role and running the blood service. However, to assist specifically on the issue of donors and donor shortages, it's worthwhile looking at two specific topics: blood shortages and donor goodwill, and the reluctance or potential reluctance of donors to donate. First, on blood shortages. A number of witnesses in the blood services spoke of shortages of blood. To take one example, in late 1984, in her oral evidence, Professor Contreras spoke to blood shortages being quite common when she took up her role as director in North London. That's INQY 1000165 at 71/19. She spoke of importing O groups from Oxford, with whom they had a contract. Correspondence from Dr. Cash also indicates Scotland was providing blood to North London at this time, and that numerous elective operations were being postponed in London because of the chronic shortage of blood. That's PRSE 302549. Now, at this point, I'm going to refer to the first of 7 documents. I'm only proposing, with Lawrence's, I'm very grateful to Lawrence for this, his help, to refer to 7 documents during these submissions. And the first one is a discussion paper for the meeting in November 1984 of the Advisory Committee on the NBTS, and the reference is CBLA 301914. Now, in this paper, is a useful pen portrait of blood use, donor sensitivities, and approaches to managing shortages. And I'm just going to, this is the only document I'm actually going to read out in full, but I am going to read this document out in full because it is useful for this very purpose throughout. So it's not for publication, Advisory Committee on the NBTS Service, Blood Shortages, that's the heading. Background. Reports have been reaching the department over the past few months and from a variety of sources that regular blood donors are not attending sessions in the usual numbers. In the London area in particular, this has resulted in shortages in blood supply, and on 2 separate occasions recently, the shortage of Group O has reached critical levels. On the first occasion, no other region was able to offer help, and London RDOs had to resort to publicity in the Evening Standard and via Capital Radio, etc. This publicity found its way into other daily newspapers also. One London hospital cancelled elective surgery as a result of the shortages. On the second occasion, London Regions accepted an offer from the Daily Express to run a front-page article, and Mr. Dawson, RDO at Brentwood, appeared as on the Jimmy Young Show on the BBC Radio 2 to promote the same message via that medium. Blood handling charges. The department received a number of letters of complaint about the introduction of blood handling charges, and letters to provincial newspapers reflect an equally critical reaction by donors. Some directors and HDOs have fielded criticism locally by appearances on local radio, etc. More recently, there was adverse publicity connected with the imposition of blood handling charges for a hospice in the southwestern region. A Dear Administrator letter was issued on 31st of October, drawing health authorities' attention to their discretionary powers to make Section 64 grants. It's hoped that the DA letter will help diffuse this particular criticism. Just to be clear, the perception on the part of the donors who were critical of this appears to have been that, wrongly, that what these blood handling charges represented was a desire on the part of the blood services to make a profit out of the gift that had been made by the donors. That is not what was happening. It was more a question of accounting as between the services. But it's understandable that that false impression could have arisen in the circumstances. Other factors. A decline in the number of industrial sessions because of the economic recession has exacerbated the situation. To a lesser extent, so too has the adverse publicity attracted by the recent Old Bailey convictions. The ever-present problem of holiday absences of own donors, no doubt, precipitated the recent crisis in London. Consultation on publicity. There's been some criticism of London RTCs for having used national publicity to overcome local shortages. Unless carefully orchestrated, this can result in embarrassing large numbers of donors turning up at sessions and having to be turned away. This too reached the press and produced adverse comment. Such locally initiated publicity can also reduce the effectiveness of organised campaigns produced by the Publicity Subcommittee and could leave few practical options in the event of a national shortage of major proportions. Accordingly, the matter will be discussed by the Subcommittee on the 7th November. An oral report will be made to the Advisory Committee members at the meeting. The Subcommittee will consider the need for an enlarged publicity campaign. Members may wish to consider what further steps might be taken to improve donor attendance. So that minute shows the delicate balancing act that has to be made between too much publicity about shortages, which can result in unbalanced provision. But the main point being identified is that there were shortages and that they had to be managed and prevented. Forgive me. In the meeting itself, a 20% uptick in demand was also attributed to cardiac surgery, and it was noted that media publicity required to restore London supplies had caused problems in the provinces. That's the same point again. Secondly, on donor goodwill and the reluctance of donors to donate. This is relevant generally, but also important as part of the understanding of the impact of non-specific testing. Donor perception of donation was an important feature of ensuring sufficiency. The example of 1984 is pertinent, as blood handling fees had an impact on donor attendance. In essence, donor perception of the meaning of blood handling fees undermined the goodwill of donors to donate. Aside from blood handling fees, another example of donor perception was the persistent belief that donation could lead to infection with HIV. A study from Newcastle of 1991 of college, university and polytechnic students at 3 higher education institutions provides an example of this. In 1991, 20.9% perceived a risk of acquiring HIV on giving a blood donation. The report concluded that these findings call for new educational initiatives to help safeguard the efficient gathering and use of blood. That's NHSBT 001-5573. Donor goodwill was and is built on donors' understanding, correct or mistaken, of the safety, ethics and probity of the donation process. Professor Tedder commented on this in his oral evidence on the 14th of October 2022 at 59:25. That's the reference in the transcript. In the context of HCV testing, and the reference is INQY 1000256. Well, everything is a balance of risk and benefit, and I don't in any way step back from the sadness that people may have been infected with HCV during that time. The introduction of a screening test, when you're uncertain of its specificity and its sensitivity, could do more harm. It could have reduced the availability of blood because of donors being unprepared, not prepared, to subject themselves to this. I can understand why there might have been concern in the transfusion services not to risk introducing something which could do more harm through rendering blood unavailable for use, rather than making people safer in the sense of removing people out of the donor panel that you don't want. We comment on this from paragraph 520 in our written submissions. It's important to recognise that a shortage of donors due to a drop in goodwill is different in nature to one due to merely an increase in demand. When demand increases, this does nothing to dissuade donors from responding to calls from additional donations. Indeed, if anything, as we learnt last year, it has the opposite effect. When a drop in goodwill is the cause of the shortage, that is also a factor which dissuades donors from responding to calls for additional donations. If the drop in goodwill is large enough, say because donors are concerned about the unsubstantiated threat of being infected with HIV from a donation, or indeed a false positive test for such a TTI on a donation, there is a real risk to there being sufficiency of supply, there being a sufficiency of supply. Indeed, we submit the relationship between donor goodwill and specificity of testing is an important aspect of a decision to introduce a test. To bring together these ideas in 1984-1985, it's useful finally to consider the answer to some parliamentary questions from the 16th of April 1985. This takes me to my second document, which is CBLA 5042. And if we go through, please, to page 7 of that document. And this is questions in the House at left-hand column under blood donors' AIDS. So
it's 403, underscore 403. Underscore 057, underscore 403, third page.
I've got a different reference.
Well, it's not on the screen at the moment.
Yes.
What you're looking for? I think you're looking, are you, for
I see what's
question
happened.
by Sir
The
Raymond
bit
Gower.
immediately above has been extracted. I'm very grateful. Mr. Dubbs asked the Secretary of State for Social Services what has been the change in the number of blood donors since the recent publicity about AIDS. And John Patton responds, figures for recent months on the number of donations are not yet available. However, inquiries suggest there's been some reduction in donations in the past few months. It's not possible to distinguish how much of this is due to publicity on AIDS and how much to other factors, such as the bad weather experienced earlier this year. Our revised leaflet for blood donors concerning AIDS was, of course, deliberately designed to cause those in the high-risk groups to refrain from donation. I should like to take this opportunity to reassure all members of the public there is absolutely no risk of contracting AIDS through donating blood. Mr. Dubbs, does the Minister agree that there is an acute shortage of blood for the transfusion services and that at least some of the shortage is caused by people's reluctance to go to blood transfusion centres for fear of being refused the chance to donate blood because of AIDS? Does the Honourable Gentleman agree that he should take further action to encourage more people to give blood? Mr. Patton, preliminary figures show a drop in donations of 5 or 6% in the first 3 months of this year. People should not be inhibited from donating blood because there is no risk of their contracting AIDS. All the equipment is sterile and it's all disposed of immediately after use. It's only used once. We are spending £250,000 in the current financial year to encourage more people to be blood donors. Does my honourable friend agree that those of us who are blood donors have a responsibility to give a lead? Can he assure us that the HTLV3 test, which is promised for July, is still on target? Because that will give great hope for the regional blood transfusion authorities. Yes, we hope to have a screening test within a few weeks. That's all I wanted to take you to. Shortages and their relevance to decision-making continued in the 1990s. In 1998 and 2001, the Advisory Committee on the Microbiological Safety of Blood and Tissue for Transplantation noted in the context of managing BCJD that proposed deferral of all those who had been transfused in the past would remove in the region of 15% of donors. The 1998 paper said 15 to 17% would be impacted. The 2001 paper said up to 14.5% of donors. The reference there is NHBT 0008129. Shortages also remain a concern today. In our written submissions at para 542, we addressed the Amber Alert declared between the 12th of October and the 8th of November. Attached to Dr. Mifflin's statement are the current policy on red cell shortages and platelet shortages. This is absolutely not to disregard or take weight away from the duty that the blood service has always owed to recipients. However, we add this to generally explain approaches to decision-making in the blood service and because it's specifically relevant to the issue of the introduction of testing, to which we now turn. Many of the core participants have made submissions on the introduction of testing. We've written on this in detail in our submissions, and we don't think it would be sensible to restate the detail of those submissions orally as well. However, we did think it would be useful to draw together some of the common threads as to what goes into a decision, whether to introduce a test or not. This is not with the intention of making submissions about whether steps taken historically were right or wrong. It is more fundamentally because it might be of assistance to restate how the blood service makes a testing decision, and also to provide an overview of this topic to those who may not have had an opportunity to review our closing in detail. A decision to introduce a test has many factors, often in competition and often uncertain. Fundamentally, however, the decision is one of ensuring that it produces a safe outcome for all recipients now and in the future. As a starting point, the transfusion of blood components is not, and is as likely ever to be, risk-free. Thus, of all the factors in the analysis, the safety of the individual recipient from a risk is of the most weight. NHSBT has had a long-standing responsibility, as we've said throughout, for the safety and supply of blood, organs, stem cells and tissues. These responsibilities all relate back to the service's operational function and the need to maintain the reliability of the blood supply. To do that, when introducing a test, the blood service must ensure that the supply is reliable through safety in quality, that is, it's free from TTIs, and safety in quantity, that is, there must be a sufficient supply, and that the recipient and donor impacts must be balanced. Therefore, there is a multiple-stage process which to be considered prior to the introduction of a test. These include the following stages. Step 1, determination of whether the virus or disease warrants a test. The decision might be whether to introduce generally or for specific diseases, or for specific classes of recipient. There are diseases, the inquiry has heard, whose effect is so mild that it may not be necessary to test for them. Step 2, whether a test exists. Step 3, whether a test is sufficiently reliable for use. Crucial here is the issue of sensitivity and specificity, which I'll turn to in just a moment. Step 4, whether a test can be scaled for high throughput. In other words, in respect of VCJD, brain biopsy as a test was not viable for this reason. Step 5, whether there is a confirmatory test. Focusing on step 3, that's whether a test is sufficiently reliable for use, and sensitivity and specificity. The sensitivity of a test is the extent to which a test correctly identifies those with a disease. This is also known as the true positive rate. The specificity of a test is the extent to which the test correctly identifies those without a disease. This is known as the true negative rate. The sensitivity of a test operates as a function of the population of individuals truly positive for a disease. In other words, you compare it with the numbers of the population who are truly positive. So, for a test that is 80% sensitive, 10% of the true positives will receive false negatives. The specificity of a test operates as a function of the entire population tested. So, for a test that is 90% specific, 10% of the entire population tested will receive false positives. The proportion of false negatives or positives to true negatives or positives for a given test will depend on the underlying incidence of a disease in the population. And this is a crucial point which we do want to stress. The performance of a test in a particular population is shown by the positive and negative predictive value of the test. This is a technically difficult area, and we go into it in slightly more detail, much more detail actually, in our written submissions, and we didn't think it was sensible to try to go through it all in detail now, because it's there already and in writing and people can read it slowly and I won't mess it up, with any luck. But in that section, paragraph 482 to 487, in that section we address the idea of the positive predictive value, that is the percentage chance that a positive test result correctly identifies an infected person, and the negative predicted value, that is the percentage chance that a negative test result correctly identifies an uninfected person. We commend that section to you, sir, because it's key to understanding the effectiveness of a screening test from our point of view. The key point, however, is this. Generally, as the prevalence of a disease in a population increases, the likelihood that a positive result on a screening test is correct likewise increases. This means that the proportion of true positives increases when compared with false positives. Thus, for populations with low prevalence of a disease, the likelihood that a positive result on a test is incorrect is higher. That is the key point, because false positives are a proportion of the overall population. Thus, the number of incorrect results is, as a starting point, much higher. In contrast, false negatives are a proportion of the infected population, and thus, as a starting point, much lower. However, for completeness, it's worth recognizing that generally, as the prevalence of a disease in a population increases, the likelihood that a negative result on a screening test is incorrect increases. In this way, the underlying incidence of a disease is key to understanding the effectiveness of a test. Indeed, omitting to consider prevalence in the general population is often called the base rate fallacy. This is because a consideration without the prevalence in the general population fails to consider the positive and negative predictive values of a test. This is a key reason why a decision concerning the introduction of a test may vary between countries. Variance in base rate can significantly change the positive and negative predictive value of a test. So, looking at specific situations, the explanation is, we think, important in understanding one aspect of a decision to introduce a test. It also reflects why it's important to assess a test generally, that is, to identify its sensitivity and specificity and any steps that can be taken to improve these by changing cut-off points on an assay, and in the specific population to ensure positive and negative predictive values are satisfactory and to ensure that the test works in the field with low human error. In our submission, these considerations are relevant to all of the decisions on testing that NUSA have to consider over the decades. Further, we would note the following. The paper on the assessment of the HIV test by PHLS is available at DHSC 40486, and the assessment by the blood services is at DHSC 301607. For HCV screening, the timeline is more confused, but assessment of both first and second generation tests did occur. Examples of such assessments are available at NHBTS 5073 and NHBT 4044. Although there are others on HCV tests, we would invite you, Sir Brian, to consider these in detail, as we say they provide important analysis of whether tests generally and some specific models of tests produced by some companies were appropriate to be introduced. Overall decisions, and so I'm coming to the end of this section, and I will then be moving on to dealing with the present, that will, I hope, be, after another minute or so, that will be a suitable moment for a break with your approval.
Yes.
Overall decisions, sensitivity and specificity are important parts of a decision to introduce a test. They're key to ensuring the safety of the recipient. They're also key to ensuring the goodwill of donors, including their mental well-being. However, they were not the only factors that go to the decision whether to introduce a test. These are factors we address at sections 4 and 5 of our written submissions. But the establishment document for the NBA gives a good précis of some of the considerations involved derived from its statutory aims. Maintaining and promoting blood and blood products supply based on the outstanding system of voluntary unpaid donors, cost-effective strategy of ensuring an adequate supply of blood and blood products to meet national needs, high standards of safety and quality in the blood supply are maintained throughout the blood service, blood products meet a consistent standard of safety and quality, cost-efficient operations of the transfusion centres and the bioproducts laboratory, both individually and together as parts of the national service. These principles flow through the statutory underpinnings of NHSBT today. They are also factors which ministers, both historically and still today, take into account in making their decisions. While we provide this to assist the inquiry, core participants and the infected and affected in understanding testing decisions made by the blood service, we do wish to make clear the following. We do not row back from our position that the blood service should have introduced HCV testing earlier than it did, and that the criticism advanced towards Dr. Lloyd at the time were incorrect. We apologise unreservedly for that. That concludes the first half of my submissions, sir, and I have now to come on to the present position and recommendations, and I hope that's a convenient moment to pause.
Yes, well, we'll take a break until 10 to 12. 10 to 12.